Hello, my name is Tony Mercer, and I'd like to begin by thanking the conference organisers for giving me this opportunity to talk about the social ontology of 12-step groups. I'll introduce myself properly because I'm wearing 3 different hats today, and all of them are relevant in some way to what I'm going to be talking about. So firstly, I'm actually in 12-step recovery myself, and I have an interest in better understanding how and why 12-step recovery works. Secondly, I'm a public health specialist. I work for Public Health England. My specialist area is drugs and alcohol, and I have a particular interest in understanding addiction and recovery as a social process. So how can 12-step groups and recovery communities support long-term recovery alongside clinical interventions? And it's probably worth saying that the ideas I'm discussing today are my own. They don't reflect those of Public Health England. Thirdly, I'm a final year philosophy student. I studied for the last four years a part-time degree in philosophy, which is coming to an end now. One of the modules I studied last year was social philosophy, and it was that module that triggered my thinking about some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to pursue 2 ideas. The first one is that 12-step groups provide a unique opportunity to do social ontology, to test out and think through some of the models and concepts that exist within social ontology. And the second idea is that following on from doing the metaphysics, we then need to focus on the epistemology. And actually we need to rethink the epistemology that we use in researching 12-step groups. And only in doing that can we then develop a really useful research methodology that we can use to actually improve the interventions that we offer to our clients. It's early days in my thinking about this stuff, so I would really welcome any contributions and feedback in the discussion that will follow this video. And if anybody is interested in pursuing these ideas and collaborating on writing them up into a paper, please do get in touch. So my first idea, that 12-step recovery groups provide a unique opportunity for doing social ontology. I'll begin by saying a little bit about what 12-step recovery groups are for people who are not familiar with them. And then I'll talk in a little bit more about 4 different lines of philosophical inquiry that we can pursue. So 12-step recovery is the most popular form of recovery from addiction. It's been around for around 80 years, and the most well-known 12-step recovery organisations are Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, and Narcotics Anonymous. The basic social unit in 12-step recovery is the group or the meeting, and they range in size from 2 or 3 members to thousands of members. For example, in Iran, Narcotics Anonymous holds meetings in large football stadiums with thousands and thousands of people present. Meetings always follow the same format. So, for example, I've attended meetings, English-speaking meetings in different countries around the world, and those meetings have followed exactly the same format that we follow in Birmingham. Individual 12-step recovery groups are organised into districts, and those districts are organised into areas or regions. Those districts and those regions often meet together into conventions which can attract several hundred or several thousand people. So the fellowships are actually global. The literature and the logos are consistent within each fellowship. The first idea I'd like to pursue is the idea of downward causation. So to what extent are individuals derived from the social? Most individuals who recover through 12-step recovery have found that they can't get clean and sober on their own, but they can when they come into a 12-step group. So it's not particularly a leap of faith, but actually an observation to say that we can prioritise the causal power of the emergent social entity, the group, over its components, the individuals. That generates further questions. So what is the genetic code of 12-step recovery that has this causal power in the groups? And how is it manifested in things like the social roles and the social narratives in 12-step groups? The second line of philosophical inquiry I want to pursue is an alternative model in social ontology. It's the model proposed by Lawson and the Cambridge Social Ontology Group. They defined social groups as social realities which are emergent, open-ended, structured transformational processes. Collective practices constitute new relationships, and these provide an organising and coherent structure which then inform new collective practices. An example from 12-step groups is service positions. So for example, people will volunteer to make coffee, set the chairs out, meet and greet new people, and so on. These are collective practices, and they actually constitute new relationships, and in turn they then organise into coherent structures for the group as a whole. Empirical research suggests that people who simply attend meetings and don't actively participate, they don't consider themselves as active members of the group, don't do as well in recovery as the people who are fully immersed in the life of the group. And this particular model of social ontology tells us that those people who are not really present in the life of a group, that the emergent social structures are not as available to them as they are to those people who are fully immersed in the life of the group. So from the world of 12-step groups, there is a little bit of evidence that this particular model of social ontology is correct. For the third line of philosophical inquiry, I've lumped together several related concepts: collective intentionality, group agency, and the distinction between the I mode and the we mode. When I was registering for this conference, we were asked to type in one of our favourite philosophical quotes, and the one that I used was, "I can't, we can." It's a saying that you hear a lot in 12-step groups. So people find they cannot get clean and sober by themselves. They come in and take part in the life of the group, and suddenly they recover from their addiction. So there's something in that coheres very strongly with the I mode and the we mode distinction. In fact, you could say it actually provides evidence for that distinction. Carl Jung talked about the 12-step program as an ongoing process of dismantling the ego. Another phrase that you hear a lot in 12-step meetings is, you keep what you've got by giving it away. The whole program is designed to overcome selfishness and self-centeredness, which people in 12-step recovery believe is at the very core of their addiction. And they do this by reaching out to other members of the group and giving themselves in selfless sacrifice and service to the life of the group as a whole. That's evidence for me of the irreducibility of collective intentionality down to its individual components. A fourth area of philosophical inquiry I want to pursue is something I didn't put in my original abstract. On March the 23rd of this year, the way that 12-step meetings happen in the UK changed as a result of the COVID pandemic and most meetings switch to Zoom and other online platforms. Personally, I'm not a big fan of online meetings, but other people are, and it's benefited a lot of people who wouldn't be able to access meetings otherwise. So we've been meeting in time, but not in space. Something is missing from those meetings, but it's actually very difficult to articulate what exactly it is. To use Aristotelian terms, can we say that those meetings have existence but not essence? Whatever it is that is missing is something very human. So there's something very human at the heart of 12-step meetings and also at the very heart of social ontology. Now I'd like to move on to the second big idea I'd like to talk about. So having done the metaphysics in social ontology, we now need to move on to the epistemology. And I'd like to bring in a couple of terms from the social sciences and anthropology and contrast thick and thin approaches. So the first term is thick and thin culture. By culture, I mean social realities, the metaphysics, if you like. So thick culture is a term that's used in anthropology, and the social has ontological status. In thin approaches to culture, the social is simply the aggregation of individuals, social atomism. Thick and thin approaches to description actually gets to the epistemology. So how do we understand the social realities described in thick and thin culture? And thick and thin description is based on suppositions about thick and thin culture. So thick description uses ethnography and interpretive approaches. The best example is probably the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who attempted to describe social practices in their social context. Thin description, on the other hand, relies on empirical and quantitative research methods. And finally, thick and thin approaches to meaning. So by meaning, I mean that knowledge which is acquired through thick and thin description. So thick meaning gives us an in-depth understanding of the social world. And thin meaning is where social realities can actually be reduced to the individual, usually psychological and particularly behavioural explanations. By the middle of the 20th century, largely as the result of the rise of behaviouralism in psychology, there was this whole-scale switch to thin description. Now, the methods that are used, the description, presupposes things about the social realities that are studied, the culture. Now, call me an old-fashioned classical realist, but I believe that the metaphysics comes first and then the epistemology is informed by the metaphysics. What we have actually done is put the epistemological cart before the metaphysical horse. Thin description, then, the research agenda is all about individual outcomes, and that's exactly what we see in the research around 12-step recovery. It's atomistic, it's reductionist, and it's decontextualized from people's actual lives. Not surprisingly then, 12-step recovery is explained in terms of social relationships between individuals. But if 12-step groups do have ontological status, then this metaphysics of social networks is inadequate. Another useful metaphor is that of hammer and nails. Using a hammer presupposes that nails are the best thing for the job. Sometimes a screw is the best thing for the job, not a nail. Only a fool would use a hammer to hammer in a screw. The wise man would use a screwdriver to screw in a screw. What we've done in our research of 12-step groups is hammering in nails. But actually, social ontology tells us that a screw is needed, not a nail. So we need to use a screwdriver, not a hammer. So why is this important? In all my philosophical thinking, I try to relate it back to my practice. So an example, when Clifford Geertz spent time with the indigenous tribes, he put a lot of time and effort into trying to find cultural practices and artifacts that he could study. Around 70 years ago, the first 100 people who recovered in the AA program wrote a book. It's called The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. There was no professional input into that book. The first 100 alcoholics who recovered using the 12-step program described in their own words alcoholism as they understood it and the program of recovery as they understood it. If we're using thick description, that book is like gold dust. While psychologists and psychiatrists continue to battle out what addiction and recovery actually is, couldn't we gain valuable insights from the study of that book? That book isn't used in most community-based professional interventions. It tends to be used in rehabs and 12-step meetings, and that's all. Most of the group work that I've seen in community services is actually built on principles that directly contradicts what that book says. Okay, in conclusion, my two main ideas are, firstly, that 12-step recovery provides a unique opportunity to do social ontology. And secondly, having done that social ontology, we then need to rethink some of our epistemology, and that will have huge implications for the research agenda looking at 12-step recovery. But hopefully out of that, we can develop new and more effective interventions for people struggling with drugs and alcohol. Okay, thank you for listening.